It was 2:40 in the morning on December 9, 2001, when a man called 911 and said he had found his wife at the bottom of the stairs. By dawn, a home decorated for the holidays had become a crime scene, and a family's laughter had been swallowed by a single, terrible question: how does a Christmas become a legacy of suspicion? Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This is the story of Kathleen Peterson, the ornaments that hung on the tree, the photographs on the mantle, the footsteps on a wooden staircase, and the night everything changed. A wife was dead. A husband was accused. The country watched, documentaries debated, and strangers online tried to piece together what had happened on a cold December night. What follows is an intimate, painstaking retelling: the background, the blow, the investigation, the courtroom, and the fragile, unresolved truth that remains. Important factual note for listeners: Kathleen Peterson was found dead on December 9, 2001. Her husband, Michael Peterson, was later convicted in 2003 before legal developments led to a retrial being granted and an eventual Alford plea in 2017. Michael Peterson was a novelist, a Vietnam veteran, a father and stepfather, a man who had built a carefully curated life, historic home in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina, a circle of friends, and a facade of domestic comfort. Kathleen, his wife, was 48 when she died, a woman remembered for her warmth, her wit, and for being the anchor of a blended family that carried both love and strain. Neighbors would later describe the Peterson home as the picture of suburban normalcy: holiday wreaths on the door, the glow of porch lights, and, on many evenings, the quiet of an ordinary house preparing for the holidays. Their family picture, however, was complicated. Michael had been married before. Both he and Kathleen had connections, friendships, and histories that would become relevant later. There were children, adult sons whose loyalties and grief would be woven through courtroom testimony. There was also a painful, earlier event that would take on chilling resonance in later reporting: the 1985 death of Elizabeth Ratliff, a friend who died after falling on a staircase in Germany, an occurrence commentators and prosecutors would point to as a troubling parallel. These background threads mattered. They would be tugged and prodded by investigators and prosecutors searching for motive and pattern. In the weeks and months before December 2001, there were ordinary holiday preparations, family photos, and the tiny rituals that make a season: wrapping paper, dinner guests, and the hush of long winter nights. There were no headlines, no courthouse lights, nothing to hint that one late night would iteratively rewrite the family history and eventually inspire a national conversation about evidence, science, and storytelling. It is the kind of discovery that lodges in memory: the phone call, the echoing footsteps, the unnerving stillness of a body at the bottom of a staircase. Michael Peterson dialed 911 in the early hours of December 9, 2001. He told the operator that he had been outside by the pool, returned to the house, found Kathleen at the bottom of the stairs, and believed she had fallen after drinking and taking Valium. He estimated a fall of 15 to 20 steps. Emergency responders arrived. What they saw would be seared into subsequent autopsy reports and trial exhibits: Kathleen's body, severe head injuries, and signs inconsistent with a simple domestic tumble. The autopsy described deep lacerations across the scalp, multiple wounds that forensic pathologists would later call blunt force trauma. Medical examiners recorded a fractured cartilage in the throat and multiple lacerations on the head, injuries severe enough to cause fatal blood loss within a short window of time. Toxicology indicated alcohol and the presence of Valium, but experts at trial differed on whether the level of impairment could explain a catastrophic fall. The details of those wounds, their number, shape, and force would become focal points of an intense forensic battle. Did Kathleen fall and strike the edge of the stair? Had she been struck by a heavy object? Or could something far stranger, an animal attack, explain the pattern? On that Christmas season night, the house that had been set for celebration became a scene investigators mapped inch by inch. Cedar needles and traces of foreign material were noted. Fibers and feathers would later be the seed of an unlikely and controversial theory. Family photographs, holiday cards, and the staircase itself, the centerpiece of their home, all became evidence. And in the hush between the house's familiar rhythms and the sudden intrusions of police lights, the first seeds of suspicion were planted. The immediate medical and investigative work set the stage. Responders documented the position of the body, the room's condition, and the initial medical assessment. The autopsy conducted by the medical examiner described injuries that suggested more than a simple fall. The reported pattern of lacerations and the thyroid cartilage fracture raised red flags. Were these the result of blunt force trauma? The prosecution would later argue yes. The defense would suggest the possibility of an accidental fall or another cause. Toxicology tests showed Kathleen had alcohol and Valium in her system, a fact the defense used to propose that she may have been impaired and stumbled. The prosecution countered that intoxication did not explain the severity and nature of the injuries. Investigators found what some argued were small animal feathers and cedar needles near the scene and on Kathleen. Some onlookers saw these as clues, others viewed them as circumstantial. The presence of such fragments would later feed the owl theory, which posits an avian attack as a plausible explanation for the scalp lacerations. That theory emerged later in appeals and in alternate investigator narratives, driven in part by neighbors and attorneys who began to look beyond the more traditional homicide theories. The courtroom is a theater of experts. Bloodstain analysts, pathologists, and crime scene technicians testified about the origin of blood patterns and wounds. One expert's testimony from an agent whose methods and conclusions would later come under intense scrutiny played a decisive role. That testimony helped the jury interpret how blood patterns could indicate a deliberate, violent assault rather than an accidental fall. Years later, questions about the reliability of that testimony contributed directly to the retrial being granted. The controversy would become emblematic of a broader conversation about forensic science and its limits. On December 20, 2001, a grand jury indicted Michael Peterson for first-degree murder. In 2003, a jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to life without parole. The conviction hinged on the prosecution's portrait, a husband who, in their narrative, had the motive and the means to attack Kathleen, a portrait sewn together from family dynamics, the autopsy's conclusions, and forensic testimony. The defense painted a different picture, a tragic accident, a man left to grapple with the violent death of his wife and the public unraveling of his life. Over the years, new layers of analysis raised doubts. Defense attorneys identified issues with key expert testimony, and appellate courts examined whether jurors had been misled. In 2011, a judge granted a new trial after concluding that a critical prosecution witness had provided misleading testimony, undermining confidence in the original verdict. This legal reversal did not mark the end of the story, far from it, but it did mark a pivot. The case had moved from a simple narrative of guilt to a study in legal fallibility and scientific uncertainty. The defense's core claim that Kathleen, perhaps impaired by alcohol and Valium, fell on the stairs and suffered fatal injuries consistent with a tragic accident. This narrative emphasizes human frailty and the chaotic ways a harmless evening can go tragically wrong. The prosecution's claim, that the pattern of injuries and the context of family dynamics pointed to an intentional assault. Prosecutors highlighted behavioral details and professional testimony to suggest motive and violent action. A startling, alternate hypothesis, that a barred owl attack outside the home inflicted talon-like lacerations and disoriented Kathleen, causing her to stumble into the house and fall down the stairs. Advocates of this idea pointed to small feathers and unusual wound patterns. Skeptics argued the evidence was thin and the wounds more consistent with blunt instruments. Nevertheless, the owl theory captured public imagination, was dramatized in later renditions of the story, and drew support from some experts and neighbors who researched raptor injuries. The idea became a cultural touchstone for how strange coincidences and small bits of evidence can create plausible-sounding alternatives to a binary guilty/innocent narrative. In 2003, Michael Peterson stood trial for murder. The prosecution assembled a narrative built around forensic testimony, the pattern of wounds, and what they argued were hidden motives. The defense countered with assertions of accident and character testimony about Michael's decency and history. One of the prosecution's most significant pieces of evidence was expert testimony interpreting bloodstain patterns. This testimony suggested that the wounds were not consistent with a single fall, instead, they implied a violent assault. However, the later discovery that certain expert testimony had been flawed would prove crucial. The expert's methodology and conclusions were contested, making the reliability of that evidence the subject of intense scrutiny. The jury convicted Michael Peterson in 2003 and imposed a life sentence without parole. For a time, that verdict seemed final. The family was divided, public opinion polarized, and the media spotlight intensified. The conviction represented the culmination of months of courtroom theater and forensic debate. Yet the story was not over. Appeals and reinvestigations began to chip away at the certainty of that verdict. After the conviction, defense attorneys appealed, arguing among other things that critical forensic testimony misled jurors. Over the following years, the case was dissected by appellate courts and re-examined through new forensic challenges. The turning point came when a judge granted a new trial in 2011, concluding that some expert testimony used by the prosecution was unreliable and that the jury had not been given a fair basis to evaluate certain forensic claims. Facing the prospect of a retrial more than a decade after the original conviction, Michael Peterson and the prosecution negotiated a resolution. In February 2017, Peterson entered what is known as an Alford plea to the charge of voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea is a legal mechanism in which a defendant accepts the consequences of a conviction without admitting guilt, acknowledging that prosecutors have sufficient evidence that could likely result in a conviction, while still maintaining innocence in public statements. Because Peterson had already served more time than the plea's potential sentence, he was released with time served. The plea allowed the legal process to conclude without a retrial and returned Peterson to the outside world, but it left many emotional and moral questions unresolved for family members, advocates, and the public. The Alford plea was legally efficient but emotionally fraught. For some, it was a pragmatic closure, the system acknowledged problems and allowed Peterson to leave prison. For others, it was an unsatisfying conclusion that neither affirmed guilt nor fully exonerated him, leaving Kathleen's death suspended between legal technicality and human tragedy. The legal system moved on, but the emotional fallout lingered. Kathleen's family, her children, siblings, and friends were left to navigate a landscape of grief complicated by public scrutiny. Holiday seasons that once meant celebration shifted into rituals of remembrance, shadowed by headlines and courtroom analysis. Michael Peterson, after release, sold the house where Kathleen died and later lived in Durham. Public portrayals from the early documentaries to dramatized retellings continued to shape his image in the public eye. Those retellings, and the public conversation around them, often revisited the same questions: did the science mislead the jury? Did confirmation bias shape the investigation? Could a stranger explanation, the possibility of an animal attack, be plausible? Or did Kathleen's death remain most plausibly a homicide? For the wider public, Kathleen's death became more than a case number, it became a parable about how fragile truth can be when evidence is filtered through human error, scientific controversy, and the relentless appetite for narrative. For her family, the holidays that followed held empty chairs, conversations about memory, and the slow, uneven work of grieving in public. Some threads pursued granular forensic details, others examined interviews, noted discrepancies, and proposed alternative timelines. The owl theory, in particular, found a foothold online. Users collated anecdotal evidence, such as mentions of feathers, the mating season behavior of barred owls, and experts willing to entertain the possibility. Other users pushed back, pointing out the limitations of internet sleuthing and the danger of making grand conclusions from partial data. Threads from years ago are full of people rewatching documentaries, linking to court transcripts, and debating whether a retrial could have reached a different outcome. The platform's collective curiosity mimicked the inquisitive, sometimes messy nature of public memory, a reminder that in the internet age, stories do not simply end when the gavel falls. They are archived, annotated, and argued over by strangers who, for better or worse, become part of the narrative's afterlife. Beyond legal briefs and forensic charts, there are small human things, the ornaments that are no longer hung, the photographs that are carefully turned to face a wall, the awkward phone calls that begin with "we were thinking of you." Kathleen's sisters, Michael's sons, neighbors, and friends, each carries a different version of that December night. For some, the court's verdict was clarity, for others, doubt lodged like a splinter. Imagine a family's first holiday after the death, the empty seat, the unwrapped gift, the recipe nobody wants to cook. That is the real measure of consequence, not legal maneuvers, though those matter, but the way the human calendar is altered, year after year. In true crime markets, the story becomes content; in human terms, it remains an open wound. And for the broader community, the case became a mirror showing how easily certainty can fracture, when forensic testimony conflicts, when evidence is ambiguous, when the internet amplifies every half-baked lead into a theory. The result is not simple closure, the result is a legacy, a set of questions that persist about justice, about the limits of science, and about how families carry memory across anniversaries and holidays. Christmas is a season of rituals, lights, songs, the simple human need to gather. Kathleen Peterson's death turned one family's rituals into questions that would outlast trials and television. The staircase case asks us to consider how we assign meaning to evidence, how we balance the hunger for narrative with the humility of uncertainty, and how the legal system wrestles with science that is imperfect and human witnesses who are fallible. In the end, this remains not just a legal file but a family's story. We do not close this chapter because it has a tidy ending, we keep it open because the human cost of unanswered questions is lived, quietly, in the spaces between annual celebrations. A holiday becomes a legacy not only by what happens in one night, but by the echo it leaves in the years that follow. If there is anything that Kathleen's story teaches us, it is this: truth is often more complicated than our desire for answers. The stairway in a home can be a place of ordinary passage or the setting of a tragic mystery. And sometimes, the more we search for certainty, the more we must live with the knowledge that some questions do not come with clean endings.